So in the English tradition, copyright law gets born as England's licensing statutes expire. There were statutes that basically regulated publishers. Publisher could only publish if they had permission to publish from the state. And as those statutes expire, one consequence is that the publishers are free of that state regulation and therefore free of that monopoly. That push backfires, and the backfire is the first copyright statute, which gives the right not to publishers but to authors. And it says authors have a limited right to control the publishing, printing, and reprinting of their maps, charts, and books. Well, that statute is obviously targeted at a very small section of the creative universe, publishing of books, maps, charts, and books, and only really regulating publishing. It's not regulating copying, it's not regulating the sale of books, it's not regulating anything beyond just this publishing industry. But over time, the regulation begins to expand. Then it starts covering areas of the arts not originally regulated. So music gets added, and then translations get added, and performances, public performances get added. And then around the turn of the century, in 1909, the law starts to regulate something called copies. Now, when they originally extended it to copies, the technology was still the technology of printing presses. So it didn't matter that they were regulating, quote, copies. But over the 20th century, as the technology of copying was more and more democratized, the regulation expanded to a regulation of anybody who had a machine to, quote, copy. Now, that didn't really matter much still until digital technologies. Because before digital technologies, you might have a Xerox machine, you might have a cassette tape player that would make a copy. That still was pretty insignificant. But once digital technologies come along, then all of a sudden every single use you make of creative work technically produces a copy. And when you produce a copy, then technically you've triggered copyright law. And once you've triggered copyright law, you've got to demonstrate either that your use is licensed or your use is not regulated because of fair use. So that we go from a culture which was essentially unregulated except for a narrow class of professional creators to a culture which is by default regulated whenever anybody accesses or uses culture and forces on ordinary people the burden of demonstrating that they in fact should be free despite this default of regulation. A massive expansion of regulation just as a consequence of the change in the platform through which we get access to our culture.